simply, I think it is a kind of fiction that questions the idea of stable boundaries between science fiction, fantasy and supernatural horror, and that exists at the interstices of those three.
Je pense que c'est une fiction qui se définit un petit peu comme une fiction qui interroge, pose la question sur les frontières a priori stables qui existent entre science-fiction, fantasy, surnaturel, et qui donc s'interroge sur ces limites-là.
I don't know about in France, but in Britain and in the US there has been a long tradition, a scholarly tradition of seeing a rigorous distinction between fantasy and science fiction, and I abjure this. I think this is bogus, and I always have, and I like weird fiction because it also seems to think this is bogus. Possibly, but even to put it in that way presumes a distinction and a kind of an osmosis, a membrane between the two. I think that the distinction exists, but I think it is a distinction in folk wisdom, the received opinions of many fans and many scholars, and that is a real existence, but it's a problematic existence. So my metaphor would not be one of the membrane, it would be one of ideology. I believe in genres, and I believe that genres have protocols, but I think what happens is and I like genres and I like generic protocols, but I think that they get translated into supposedly hard and fast heuristics or organizing principles, and that I think is problematic. I can give you an example. In the case of science fiction and fantasy, which is my major interest, the writer Darko Suvin has written about this, and for him, the way science fiction works is based on a kind of progressive scientific estrangement, as opposed to a kind of mystification, a dubious mystification in fantasy. And I think that this is simply not true and leads to fallacious literary criticism and often bad fiction. You can see this, there was an argument between Jules Verne and H.G. Wells about the moon, because Verne was very upset because the way Wells has his spaceship go to the moon is with magic anti-gravity paint, and Verne says, this is not real. He said, ça c'est très joli, but it's not true. And many more of us read Wells' moon book than Verne's moon book, certainly in Britain, with no disrespect to Verne, because his fidelity to what he thought wrongly was rigorous science hurt the narrative of his story.
Imaginaire.
As a writer, ever since I was a tiny child, I don't sustain interests in telling stories unless there is an element of the unreal. And it can be a small element or it can be a large element. But what drives me is that sense of the fantastic, however it's expressed. As a reader, I sometimes read more realist fiction, but as a writer, I simply have no sustained interest in it.
Toi, s'il n'y a pas cette espèce d'élément irréel à un moment.
I can come up with all kinds of post facto theorizations of why that is, but it starts from a position of love and an affective drive, and I can only make sense of it afterwards, and not very good sense.
Il y a un peu l'histoire.
About the city in the city?
Ouais.
Well, it was an attempt to write something very faithful to a crime novel. It is a noir novel, but it is an attempt to show faith both to the noir tradition and the fantastic tradition, particularly as inspired by Bruno Schulz and Kafka and certain Alfred Kubin, writers like that.
C'est une tentative.
What I would say is it is a police procedural about a murder that takes place within two cities that exist within a very strange relationship to each other. And I could say more, but it would be a spoiler. And what I hope is that part of the pleasure is learning about the relationship between the two cities as the book unfolds. So I would rather not say too much more. But
pour ce roman.
It is very moving to receive prizes, particularly prizes that you grew up seeing on the covers of books. You know, I can't believe I won a Hugo. When I was 10, I was reading books that said Hugo on them. And the funny thing is, you know, as you get older, you become properly cynical about the micro-politics of prizes. You know that it's friends and who knows this, and you know, and yet, if you win, it's beautiful. Yes, I know it is, if anything, it is a little bit camp of me to write a book called The City and the City, and that was a little bit deliberate. I know I have gained a reputation as a, you know, quote, city writer, and so this is, a ludicrously over-determined city book. But I make no apologies for that. I love cities, I always will. Sorry, I should also say that these reputations become self-sustaining. So, for example, Iron Council, fully a third or a half of Iron Council takes place in a wilderness. And no one ever calls me a wilderness writer, and I really like that wilderness I described there, but you know. You said that was a little question, that's a huge question. Michael Moorcock is someone who I love because he spans the pulp tradition up to the experimental avant-garde tradition and everything in between, because I think he is a very generous writer, and I think he is a writer infused with a kind of emancipatory humanism, which I find very moving within what might otherwise look like straightforward adventure stories.
Qui sont bien plus que ça.
In the case of Peake, what I find so interesting about Peake, and have ever since I read him, is that he feels completely sui generis. That sui generis?
Sui generis.
So, of course, one can trace a lineage if one wants, but what's more interesting to me is that he feels like he comes out of nowhere. He is not a genre writer really, although it's genre writers who love him, nor is he a mainstream writer. He's like nothing that has ever been before or since. And I love, and there's a few pieces of literature, a few writers, of which he is one, who feel like they have arrived ex nihilo in the literary firmament without tradition before or after. That I find amazing. There's a book coming out next year called Embassy Town, which is a science fiction novel. Having said there's no distinction between science fiction and fantasy, this is very much a science fiction novel. And I'm working on 2 novels at the moment, and I am going to be very annoying and not tell you about them because I feel very superstitious, because I feel the moment you start talking about what you're working on, God looks down with a wry smile and comes up with her own plans.
Her own plans?
Her own plans. Her.
Ok. Donc j'ai un roman qui sort l'année prochaine, qui s'appelle Embassy Town, qui est un roman de science-fiction. Bon, alors je vous dis ça après avoir dit qu'il n'y avait pas de différence entre la science-fiction et la fantasy, mais c'est quand même plus un roman teinté de SF. Et je travaille sur 2 livres en ce moment, et je vais être très, très agaçant, mais je ne vais pas vous en dire un seul mot parce que je suis extrêmement superstitieux. Je suis persuadé qu'à partir du moment où vous commencez à parler d'une histoire en cours, Dieu vous regarde et après arrive avec ses propres projets. Donc je préfère pas vous en parler pour l'instant.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Thank you. I was just fucking with gender there, sorry.
Okay,